The 3 words hung in the air, heavier than the scent of old books and rain-soaked coats. I want you. It wasn't a proposition or a flirtation. It was a verdict. A statement of fact delivered with a quiet finality that stripped the air from Becca's lungs. For a moment, she was paralyzed. Her mind, usually a fortress of legal arguments and strategic calculations, was a blank slate. Jessica's gaze held her, not with the predatory fire she'd expected, but with a startling vulnerability. The games were over. The masks were off. This was real, and Becca had nowhere to hide. She took a half-step back, the heel of her sensible shoe making a sharp, definitive sound on the hardwood floor. It was the sound of her defenses snapping back into place. "Jessica," she began, her voice tight, clinical. It was the voice she used for hostile witnesses. "This is wildly inappropriate." A flicker of disappointment crossed Jessica's face, so fleeting Becca might have imagined it. "Inappropriate," Jessica repeated, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "You're standing in your boss's office, being propositioned by his ex-wife moments after you kissed her with enough force to crack a rib. Yes, I suppose inappropriate covers it." She let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Is that all this is to you? A breach of professional etiquette?" "I just got my partnership," Becca bit out, the words a shield. "The ink on the door isn't even dry. This, us, is a professional liability. It's a conflict of interest. It's..." "An excuse?" Jessica finished for her, her voice soft again, cutting through Becca's frantic rationalizations. She didn't move closer, but her presence filled the room, leaving Becca feeling cornered. "Becca, look at me. Do you really think I don't know what you've sacrificed to get where you are? Do you think I would jeopardize that?" "You already are," Becca shot back, gesturing wildly at the space between them. "This is jeopardizing it. My focus, my reputation, everything has to be perfect. I don't have room for this." She didn't say the rest out loud. For chaos. For feeling. Jessica's shoulders slumped slightly, a quiet admission of defeat. She gave a slow, sad nod. "I see," she said, and the sincerity in her voice was more devastating than any argument. The fortress of Becca Rivers. Not a single crack allowed in the foundation. The fight drained out of Becca, replaced by a cold, familiar resolve. Jessica had named it perfectly. Her life was a fortress, and she was its sole defender. This feeling, this woman, was a siege she could not afford to withstand. "I can't do this," Becca said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, but the words were made of steel. "I'm sorry." She didn't wait for a reply. Turning with a precision that felt rehearsed, she walked out of the office, leaving Jessica standing alone beside Mark's empty desk. She didn't look back. Every step down the hallway was a deliberate choice. "This is the right decision," she told herself. "This is how you win." The click of the heavy front door shutting behind her was the only sound that answered back. The first day was a testament to her resolve. Becca arrived at the office before the sun, her heels echoing in the empty halls. Her new corner office, which should have been a trophy, felt like a pristine, sterile observation deck. She arranged her desk with geometric precision, losing herself in the familiar ritual of control. Work was her fortress, and she retreated behind its walls with a vengeance. She built a bulwark of case files, depositions, and contracts, each document another stone in the wall separating her from the memory of Jessica's confession. She was flawless, a machine of billable hours and ruthless efficiency. When Mark passed her in the hall, she gave him a crisp, professional nod, her eyes never quite meeting his. He was smart enough not to press. But as the days bled into a week, a new unsettling feeling began to creep in. An absence. Becca found herself unconsciously checking her phone, a nervous tick she couldn't quell. She was braced for an attack, a witty, cutting text message, a surprise appearance at her favorite coffee shop, a dramatic, rain-soaked confrontation. She was prepared for a siege. What she got was silence. Absolute, deafening silence. Jessica Lane had vanished from her life as abruptly as she had entered it. There were no calls, no emails, no cleverly worded messages passed through Mark. Nothing. The silence was a void, and it unnerved Becca more than any pursuit. It was a tactical retreat she hadn't anticipated, a strategic masterstroke that left her feeling strangely exposed. Her victory felt hollow, the spoils of a war no one else was fighting. Late one night, in the quiet office of her nonprofit, Jessica stared at her phone. The screen cast a pale blue light on her face. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard, a dozen different messages composed and deleted in her mind. You could have just said no. Deleted. Too accusatory. Are you okay? Deleted. Too weak. I hope your partnership is everything you wanted. Deleted. Too passive-aggressive. With a sigh, she finally typed out a single, simple sentence. I meant what I said. She stared at the words. A final, vulnerable truth laid bare. It was everything she felt, stripped of wit and armor. Her thumb moved to the send button, hesitating for a long moment. Then, with a quiet finality that mirrored Becca's own, she deleted the message and turned the phone over on her desk. She would not chase someone who had so clearly run away. She would respect the fortress walls, even if it broke her own heart to do so. At the end of the week, Becca stood looking out the floor-to-ceiling window of her office. The city lights glittered below, a sprawling map of a world she had conquered. She had won. She was safe. Her fortress was secure, and she had never felt more alone. 3 weeks passed. The silence solidified, becoming a permanent fixture in Becca's life. Her routine was a marvel of disciplined denial. She won a preliminary injunction on a difficult case, dismantled a plaintiff's argument in a key deposition, and earned quiet nods of approval from the other partners. She was everything she had ever set out to be: powerful, respected, and untouchable. And every evening she returned to an apartment that felt less like a home and more like a beautifully furnished, soundproofed box. Mark watched the transformation with a growing sense of unease. He saw the flawless work product, but he also saw the dark circles under her eyes and the way she flinched almost imperceptibly when he approached her desk. She was a ghost, haunting her own corner office. The breaking point came not at the firm, but at home. Mark was cooking dinner while Ludwig scrolled through his phone, an uncharacteristically grim expression on his face. I had coffee with Jess today, Ludwig said, his voice flat. He didn't look up from the screen. Oh, yeah? How is she? Mark asked, stirring a pot of simmering tomato sauce. She's fine, Ludwig said, infusing the word with a heavy dose of irony. She's throwing a fundraiser, launching a new literacy program, and working 16-hour days. She says she's never been better. He finally looked up, his eyes meeting Mark's. She's building her walls back up, Mark. So high and so fast, I'm afraid no one will ever get through again. She didn't mention Becca once. It's like she's erased the entire month from her memory. Mark stopped stirring, the spoon hovering over the pot. Ludwig sighed, setting his phone down. This wasn't the plan. You wanted to give them a nudge. Instead, you pushed two of the most emotionally guarded people we know into a head-on collision, and now they've both retreated to opposite ends of the universe. He shook his head, his voice softening with concern. This isn't a game. They're both hurting. The words landed with the weight of an indictment. Mark thought of Becca, a brilliant legal mind running on fumes and sheer willpower. He thought of Jessica, hiding her wounds behind a flurry of good deeds. He had set this in motion, believing, perhaps naively, that two people so perfectly suited for each other would find their way. He had underestimated the sheer force of their fear. He turned off the stove. the aroma of garlic and basil suddenly cloying. His responsibility was clear. He couldn't fix it for them, but he couldn't stand by and watch the collateral damage pile up any longer. He had to intervene. It happened on a Tuesday. The afternoon was a blur of fluorescent lights and the low hum of the office. Becca was reviewing a complex merger agreement, her red pen hovering over a problematic clause. She'd been staring at the same paragraph for 10 minutes, the words swimming before her eyes. Needing a momentary break, she leaned back in her chair and let her gaze drift towards the hallway. And then she froze. Walking past the glass wall of her office was Jessica. Becca's heart gave a painful, powerful lurch against her ribs. She wasn't dressed in the slightly chaotic, artistic way Becca remembered. She wore a sharply tailored navy blue blazer, her hair pulled back in a sleek professional ponytail. She looked powerful, distant, and impossibly chic as she headed towards Mark's office. Becca told herself to look away, to stay focused, to remain in her fortress. But it was a battle she was destined to lose. Jessica handed a large manila envelope to Mark's assistant, shared a brief, polite word, and then turned to leave. Their paths would cross in the main hallway if she moved now. It was a terrible, irresistible impulse. On sheer instinct, a force stronger than her own self-preservation, Becca stood up and stepped out of her office, her hands feeling cold and clammy. "Jessica," she said. The name felt foreign on her tongue. Jessica stopped and turned. The playful light Becca was used to seeing in her eyes was gone, replaced by a cool, polite neutrality. It was the look one gives a passing acquaintance. "Becca," she replied, her voice just as level. There was no anger, no sadness. There was nothing. It was 1,000 times worse. The silence stretched for a beat. Becca's mind raced, a frantic search for the right words. "I'm sorry" felt inadequate. "I made a mistake" felt like a legal admission of fault. What she really wanted to say was something far more complicated. "I miss the way you looked at me, like I was the only person in the room. I miss the feeling of chaos you brought into my perfectly ordered world." The thoughts were a tangled mess of fear and pride, trapping the words in her throat. She started, but the sentence died before it could form. Jessica gave a small, impatient nod, as if concluding a business meeting that had run too long. "I have to get to a fundraiser," she said, her tone crisp and final. "Have a good afternoon." As Jessica turned and walked toward the elevators, panic finally broke through Becca's paralysis. She hurried after her, her sensible heels making sharp, frantic clicks on the polished floor. "Jessica, wait," Becca called out, her voice strained. "Just let me explain." Jessica stopped just as the elevator doors slid open. She turned her head slightly, not enough to fully face Becca, but enough to deliver her final words over her shoulder. Her voice was ice. "You made yourself perfectly clear, Becca," she said, stepping into the empty elevator. "There's nothing left to explain." The doors slid shut with a soft, final chime, leaving Becca standing alone in the hallway, staring at her own reflection in the polished steel. From the doorway of his office, unseen by either of them, Mark had watched the entire exchange. His jaw was tight, but he remained silent, stepping back into the shadows of his office and leaving Becca to face the consequences of her own actions. A calendar notification popped up on Becca's screen. It was from Mark. Subject: Performance Review. My office. 4 p.m. The request was so formal, so corporate, it sent a chill down her spine. Mark didn't do performance reviews. He managed by walking around, by quick check-ins and casual praise. This was different. This was a summons. She spent the next hour gathering her metrics, printing reports, and building a case to defend her professional conduct, her mind snapping back into its familiar, comfortable role of a litigator preparing for battle. At precisely 4 p.m., she walked into his office, a folder of her accomplishments held like a shield. Mark was sitting behind his desk, his usual easygoing demeanor gone. He gestured to the chair opposite him. "Close the door," he said. Becca complied, her heart thudding a slow, heavy rhythm. "Becca," Mark began, a genuine smile touching his lips. "I wanted to formally congratulate you on your first month as partner. The numbers you're pulling on the Harrison merger are exceptional. The board is thrilled. Honestly, you're exceeding every expectation." "Thank you, Mark," she said, the words feeling rehearsed. "I'm committed to proving the board made the right decision." They discussed the specifics of the case for a few more minutes, but the conversation felt hollow, a performance for an audience of one. When the work talk finally wound down, a heavy silence settled in the room. Becca gripped the folder in her lap, her knuckles white. She should leave. The review was over, but her feet felt rooted to the floor. Just as she was about to stand, she faltered. Her gaze dropped to the polished surface of Mark's desk. "How is she?" The question was barely a whisper, so quiet she wasn't sure she'd actually said it aloud. But she had. Mark's smile faded, replaced by a look of deep, knowing sympathy. He knew exactly who she was. "She's fine," he said, his voice neutral. He offered nothing more, forcing Becca's hand. The simple, unhelpful answer was the final crack in her composure. The words came tumbling out, a frantic justification for the coldness she knew he'd witnessed in the hall. "It's just, I can't," she stammered, gesturing vaguely. "I've worked too hard for this, for the promotion. I can't screw it all up for something that's complicated." Mark leaned back in his chair, studying her for a long moment. "Look," he said finally, his voice softening. "I haven't had a lot of experience with women, but I have 12 years of experience with Jessica." He leaned forward, his gaze direct and sincere. "And what I can tell you is this. She is nothing like whatever you're afraid of. For our entire marriage, a lavender marriage, she was nothing but supportive. She champions the people she cares about more than anything. A job, a promotion, a title. That would never be a reason for her to tear someone down. It would be the reason she'd build them up." He let the words sink in, a direct counter-argument to the case Becca had built against herself. Don't let the career you earned be the reason you run away from the one person who would be your biggest fan. Becca walked out of Mark's office in a daze. His final words echoed in the sudden silence of the hallway, dismantling years of carefully constructed logic. The one person who would be your biggest fan. She didn't return to her desk. Instead, she walked past her own corner office, a space that now felt less like a fortress and more like a cage, and didn't stop until she reached the floor-to-ceiling windows at the far end of the hall. The city sprawled below, a glittering testament to ambition and drive, the very things she had used as a shield. For her entire adult life, her career had been her primary relationship. It was demanding, but it was predictable. It rewarded logic and punished emotion. It was safe. Jessica was the opposite of safe. She was a chaotic variable in a life built on constants. Mark's words had exposed the fundamental flaw in her argument. She had told herself that Jessica was a risk to her career, but the truth was the inverse. Her career was the excuse she used to avoid the risk of Jessica. The risk of feeling something she couldn't control, of wanting something she couldn't litigate into submission. She had treated happiness like a hostile takeover, something to be defended against at all costs. She thought of Jessica's face in the hallway, the cool, polite dismissal that had shattered her more than any angry outburst could have. That was the consequence of her winning. A victory that felt exactly like a loss. A decision crystallized in her mind, sharp and clear. It wasn't a choice born of logic or strategy, but of a deeper, more urgent truth. She could have the corner office, the title, and the respect of her peers, and still be utterly, profoundly alone. Or she could take the risk. Without another thought, she turned from the window, walked directly to the elevator, and rode it down to the lobby. She bypassed her car service, striding out into the cool evening air and hailing a cab with a sharp, uncharacteristically decisive wave of her hand. "Where to?" the driver asked. She gave him the address of the non-profit, her voice steady for the first time all day. The fortress had been breached. The litigator had rested her case. Now, all that was left was Becca Rivers, driving through the city streets, not to win an argument, but to finally surrender. The cab ride was a blur of rain-streaked neon, and her own reflection staring back at her from the window. The fortress had been breached. The litigator had rested her case. Now, all that was left was Becca Rivers, driving through the city streets, not to win an argument, but to finally surrender. She paid the driver and stepped out onto the wet pavement in front of the nonprofit. The lights were still on inside. Taking a breath that did little to calm the frantic beating of her heart, she pushed open the door. Jessica was at her desk, surrounded by stacks of paper, her back to the entrance. She was on the phone, her voice low and tired. "No, I understand the budget constraints. Just see what you can do." "Thanks." She hung up with a sigh and ran a hand through her hair. Becca's presence seemed to register a moment later, a shift in the atmosphere. Jessica stiffened and turned slowly in her chair. When she saw Becca standing there, rain-soaked and resolute, her expression hardened into a familiar, cool mask of indifference. "Lost?" Jessica asked, her voice laced with ice. "No," Becca said, her own voice surprisingly steady. She took a step forward. "I came to tender my official surrender." Jessica let out a short, bitter laugh. "There's no war here, Becca. You made that perfectly clear. You won. Congratulations. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a fundraiser to salvage." She turned back to her computer, a clear dismissal. But Becca didn't leave. She walked forward until she was standing directly in front of the desk, blocking Jessica's view of the screen. "That's where I was wrong," Becca said, her voice dropping, losing its lawyerly edge and becoming something more raw. "I didn't win. I hid. I used my career, my ambition, my entire life as a shield because I was terrified." Jessica finally looked up, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Terrified of what?" "Of you," Becca admitted, the words tasting like freedom. "Of this. Of feeling something I couldn't control, something I couldn't predict or file away. I was a coward." She leaned forward, placing her hands flat on the desk, mirroring Jessica's pose from that day in Mark's office. The power dynamic had finally, irrevocably, shifted. "I don't know how to do this," Becca whispered, her gaze locked with Jessica's. "I have no strategy, no argument. All I know is that the thought of you walking away for good, it feels like losing everything that matters." Jessica stared at her, the icy mask beginning to crack, revealing the hurt and hope warring beneath. Becca straightened up, taking a small step back without thinking, as if making space for something she couldn't name. Jessica rose slowly, never breaking eye contact. She rounded the desk until only a foot of space separated them. The air crackled, thick with unspoken words and months of pent-up tension. "You are going to be the death of me, Becca Rivers," Jessica murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "Then we'll go down together," Becca replied, her last shred of control dissolving. That was all it took. Jessica closed the distance between them, her hands coming up to cup Becca's face as her mouth crashed down on hers. It wasn't gentle or tender. It was a storm. It was desperate and hungry, a raw collision of need and relief. Becca gasped into the kiss, her hands tangling in Jessica's hair, pulling her closer. It was a kiss of surrender, but not of defeat. It was messy and fierce, tasting of rain and regret, and a startling, brilliant hope. Jessica's tongue swept against hers, and a fire ignited deep in Becca's core, burning away the last of her defenses. Jessica pressed forward, backing Becca into the desk, the hard edge a grounding force in the dizzying spiral of sensation. This was chaos. This was feeling. This was Jessica. And for the first time, Becca wasn't running from it. She was running toward it. 1 year later, the apartment, once a shrine to minimalist beige, was now a vibrant, lived-in space. It was a perfect, chaotic merger of its two occupants. Becca sat curled on the sofa, a tablet balanced on her knees, her brow furrowed in concentration as she scrolled through a document. The only light came from the screen and a single lamp, casting long shadows across the room. A floorboard creaked. Jessica emerged from the hallway, wrapped in a silk robe, her hair still damp. She paused, watching Becca for a moment, a slow, wicked smile spreading across her face. She padded silently across the rug until she was standing behind the sofa, leaning over Becca's shoulder. "Objection," Jessica whispered, her breath warm against Becca's ear. "Counsel is working past 9 p.m. on a Friday. That's a punishable offense." Becca didn't look up from the screen. "Sustained," she murmured, her finger still tracing a line of text. "But I'm filing a motion for one last summary judgment." Jessica laughed, a low, throaty sound. She reached over and plucked the tablet from Becca's hands, setting it on the coffee table just out of reach. Motion denied. "Hey," Becca protested, finally turning. "I was at a critical juncture." "So are we," Jessica said, her eyes glittering. "Right now, you and me." Instead of sitting beside her, she moved with a fluid grace, swinging a leg over Becca's lap to straddle her, settling her weight against her. The move was bold, possessive, and left Becca breathless. "I was thinking about our first meeting. You, in that severe suit, looking like you wanted to arrest me. You looked like you were about to psychoanalyze me, and then bill me for it," Becca retorted, a smile playing on her lips as her hands came to rest naturally on Jessica's hips. "I did," Jessica admitted without shame. "And my diagnosis was that you were dangerously repressed." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to the intimate purr that still made Becca's stomach flutter. "And you know what I've found after a year of intensive hands-on research?" "What's that?" Becca asked, her voice a little breathless. "My diagnosis was correct." Jessica's hand came up to cup Becca's jaw, her thumb gently stroking her cheek. "You still have that tell, you know, when you're trying very, very hard not to feel something." "And you still bite your lip when you know you've won," Becca countered, her gaze dropping to Jessica's mouth. Jessica's smile was triumphant. "Then I guess we're both guilty." The banter melted away, replaced by the familiar, potent chemistry that always simmered just beneath the surface. The air grew thick, charged with memory and intent. This was their favorite game, the one they never tired of playing. A slow, confident smile spread across Becca's face, mirroring Jessica's triumph. She leaned in, closing the last inch of space between them until their lips were almost touching. Her voice was a low whisper, a final verdict delivered with absolute certainty. "Case closed," she murmured. And then she kissed her, not with the desperation of their first encounters, but with the deep, unhurried passion of someone who knew every secret, had won every appeal, and was finally completely home.